Yeah, I wanted to do, for a while I'd been kind of thinking about doing this project, which is based on the fact that my great-great-grandfather and mother moved to Hong Kong in 1870 and lived there for 20 years. My great-grandfather was born there, and then he moved to Guernsey. And I find this kind of island, like this fascination with island life, quite interesting, moving from one island to another. And then when I looked into it, Hong Kong is actually pretty much the same landmass as Guernsey, but they've just had such different histories in the last 150 years. And I then moved, I was obviously born in Guernsey, but then I moved to Hong Kong in my 20s and I've got my own relationship and love for the island of Hong Kong. But the body of work is based on, we've got a collection of photos that my great-great-grandfather took in the late 19th century in Hong Kong, which are all black and white, just everyday scenes, playing tennis, sailing, reading, hiking.
So old photography.
Old photos, black and white. And I've taken those as the kind of inspiration for each painting. And I've done 6 on Hong Kong and then 2 paintings which are based on Guernsey at the same time. So in the kind of late 19th century. And yeah, they're just semi-imagined. I don't necessarily know who the figures in the paintings are. I know that, maybe some of them are my great-great-grandfather, but I quite like the idea that I don't really know what's going on in the photographs. And for me, for my practice, I guess, because of my background also in conservation, I have a real interest in materials. So I've chosen very coarse weave linen, and I've used gilding in all but one of the paintings. And there's kind of symbolism in the paintings through the materials rather than through the subject matter. So the linen is kind of representing the kind of harshness of island life, that we kind of have to work within limitations and we can't always be in control of our life. We get fogged in, the boat doesn't come in, or, it's not plain sailing. The gold is representing the lure of leaving. We all want to leave, find our fortune, travel, explore, or I think growing up as a teenager on an island, you want to leave at some point.
Definitely, yeah.
So the gilding over the linen, you can't disguise the linen, you can still see it through the gold. So you can't hide your island roots. It's still part of you, you take it with you. And it's kind of moulded who you are as a person when growing up on an island. And I think that is, growing up on an island is a magical thing. It's very different to growing
quite specific.
up. It is, yeah.
Yeah.
But you can't really articulate that unless you have a different experience. It's all I know. I then used a very restricted palette of just four colours, so French ultramarine, yellow ochre and burnt sienna, and then titanium white. So kind of also reflecting limited resources, doing the best with what you've got. So I was trying to really, really stretch that palette to give me as much as it could, which was challenging at times.
But it brings a nice cohesion to the work when the palette is limited. It brings everything together.
Absolutely,
It fits together.
Exactly, it draws it together. But it's also quite muted, and that's kind of offset against the garish kind of 23 karat gold. So yeah, it's been an interesting challenge, and it's nice to provide some limitations, right? Work within some constraints.
It's helpful.
Definitely, I think it's needed actually.
I think what you were saying about the materials is quite linked to your work, isn't it? Like that idea that the materials, because it's so much about what you've been doing.
Yeah, I think I couldn't have made a harder project for myself to literally go back to actually producing the actual ink. Each ink took about 3 hours to make, and then obviously some of the inks were failures.
So how did you make them?
Well, I did a lot of research online. I was influenced greatly by dye makers and wool dyers, and there's a whole sort of community out there who are wanting to naturally dye natural materials. So quite a few of the plants are already researched. But the tricky thing was, and I also found this amazing book by Jason Logan called Making Inks from Foraging. And so I used his recipes, but then resourced the plants from these dyers. But the trick was that when I then applied the inks to paper, they didn't react like the inks did on cloth. And some of the colours, so a lot of the very purple inks overnight would change to a green.
Oh, how interesting.
That's amazing.
So that was like the biggest challenge of all with the whole project. So consequently, I had to make hundreds of little test sheets. And so where I would have to lay, if I was using a background colour, I'd then have to experiment with all the other colours because they reacted differently on each. You'll see that there are some colours that correspond there.
So is this all stuff that you had in your garden? Or
yeah, and it's all organic and all from my garden.
Did you all from your garden?
Yeah, so that rule that you said, that restriction, I decided that it has to, again, with that theme of mine, the art of nature on paper, I've kind of decided that I'm going to have very pure materials. I'm going to be very conscious of where they originate. So I thought, well, lots of people were lovely and offered me fruits and things, but I decided now I'm going to be very strict. I'm going to stick to my garden because I know it's 100% organic. And the only thing that wasn't organic, or I don't know if it's organic or not, it's more mineral than organic, was I found this recipe in the book for making this amazing turquoise. And that was by dissolving copper in salt and vinegar. So that I called my copper oxide. But I did manage to find the copper in the garden because when we had our roof renovated, the roofers dropped lots of copper nails. So I harvested all those and made my turquoise with those. So that's the only one that I don't really understand where it fits in my
So is it coming from the plants or the soil, the earth, the dyes?
The dyes are all from plants. So either fruit,
you've got myrtle,
roots,
red onion,
or flowers, and they're all grown in
willow.
the garden. And willow's the most, well, I've got like 3 of my favourites there, which are the raspberry, which when you put it on this amazing paper, it's really heavily sized. I chose something that's very quite coarse for a paper, and it's made in India, and it's made from.
Is it Cardi paper?
It is Cardi paper.
I've got some Cardi paper. One of my paintings is on a Cardi paper.
Oh,
actually,
brilliant!
It's the first time I've
so
used
when you
it.
read up on it, their credentials are amazing, and it's made from recycled cotton. So it's just got this real, but I started with another paper, an English paper.
Real weight.
It's almost like fabric, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think that kind of works because these are almost like dyes. It kind of needed something, but the previous paper, the Two Rivers paper, which is made at Cheddar Gorge, it was too absorbent. It just soaked it all up, whereas this is heavily sized, so it actually sat on the top, which is much more rewarding.
It is a really interesting paper to work with. It's, like you say, it's a bit more like fabric, isn't it? But I found it quite different. I've just got one painting on that, and the rest is just Saunders Waterford. But yeah, it's quite different to work on.
It's got inconsistencies as well, and sometimes you'll see a sort of thread of cotton in it. And the edges, they're all individually moulded sheets, so you've got these lovely.
Did you get the circular ones?
All circular.
Ooh, I saw
and
those.
I went for some of the elephant ones as well. So I've had a really good time, really kind of letting myself loose, playing with the inks.
Obviously, with your works being circular, they can hang in any direction. Compositionally, how do you create the final piece and decide how it will be framed?
I think in the end, they do have a right way up. I did quite like the idea that the viewer was able to choose and that we'd have circular frames. But ultimately, when you start wandering around the picture and it's kind of organically grown. Well, different pictures had different processes, but they were all very much ink led. And so again, the layering of the inks led the process, and also some of them are quite interesting. Some sit on top better than others, others just seep into the paper. So mostly it was sort of organically looking at the composition, wandering around each time.
Letting it kind of form itself and then deciding how to kind of change it a little bit or move it
as I was
or
saying,
tip it.
Punctuating it, and maybe, you know, I'd have a big space, and either sometimes a big space is lovely, you kind of want the picture to kind of lean that way. Other times you think, well, it really needs something. But some of the inks also are quite crystalline when they dry. And again, because they sit right on the top, you're working with that depth of field as well. So and so a lot of them are very organic, different, experimenting with different techniques as well. So the first picture I did was very much, it was a huge picture, not on the Cardi paper. Where I was using mark making, which is another interest of mine, which I totally love, where, you know, spontaneously reacting to the ink and and almost embellishing it with the marks. But then the next series, which I called the Guernsey series, that was literally, I mean, it was like jumping into a black hole, because I just didn't know what the inks were going to do. And so started off with my various colours, and then found towards the end, I thought I was just getting this lovely composition, feeling really happy with it. But the raspberry ink obliterated any colour underneath. It just became this overpowering ink that was kind of bullying all the other colours.
I think with watercolour, I mean, because I work in watercolour, you do have to get to know your colours, don't you? And also sometimes they behave in ways that you don't want them to. It seems it's very kind of like instinctive what you're doing.
Yeah, so that was very much all the time learning.
Yeah.
But the Guernsey ones were very much my kind of learning pictures. Then I was really taken by an image that I found online of mycorrhizal fungi, which are fungi that enable plants to grow, and they kind of extend off plant roots. It's an absolutely beautiful image. And so then I wanted that idea of using the inks to kind of using the rivulets of ink and the way they ran and the roots they took down the page to try and create this root structure.
So did you use gravity?
Yes, so water
and
gravity and tipping and having to go back, you know, layer after layer to get a satisfactory result. The nematode pictures are more considered. Again, by then I was getting a bit more of a hold on the inks. I actually used a paintbrush in this one.
So how many for the body of work that's now going to the exhibition? I imagine there was a lot of kind of test runs that have been discarded. And how did that work in terms of?
I went down a complete wrong route actually at one stage, where I was using this very felty cotton paper, and I was trying to be influenced by my first picture, which was very loose with lots of mark making, and I had this sort of flower emblem which I really wanted to somehow bring through all the work, and I just got really, really tight with it, and this raspberry ink was just pink and awful and everywhere, and so that had to be completely rejected and then that made me research the paper again, because I wasn't happy with the way it was reacting. And then when I found the Cardi paper, I thought, oh, this is it. I'm absolutely, I know where I'm going, because it just ran, I had more control over the ink.
Compositionally, is there a particular ink that anchors all of your paintings? That not paintings, but that you find in all of the pieces of work?
I think there are colours that have become my friends. So, and also, now I've got to grips with the raspberry, and I've discovered it does amazing things. That if you let it completely disperse on the paper, the outer edges of it become this beautiful pale blue. And then I realised that the more sugary inks, like the sort of damson and plum, would sit on top of it. I actually found something that was stronger than the raspberry, which helped them put it in place on the page. Willow makes the most lovely yellow. So again, I a bit like you, that the colours, I had favourites and they kept coming back
Yeah.
and using them over and over again. And I think again, trying to create a range of colour in the whole body of work as well, trying to have some sort of ones that are more on the red hue, more on the yellow, and then more the green they seem to default to a green, so that a lot of them there's quite a strong sort of green.
What do you want people to see in your work when they view it?
What I love is I'm hoping when you walk in you have the impact of the piece, and obviously on the elephant paper they are big. But the thing that I really love is the closer and closer you walk to them, the more you explore. You can then get in really close and you can just see all these little inks all playing and fighting off each other. You can see where, maybe where I've put the raspberry, not the raspberry, I discovered another ink, tomato ink, is almost clear. It's like a varnish. I was expecting this amazing red, but the pigment doesn't come out at all in the ink. But it would almost bleach the colour underneath, so I could break up some of these strong areas of raspberry. So when you get up
create
close,
space almost.
yes,
Yeah.
so when you get up close, and that's the bit I really want to encourage people to do, don't just stand back. You've got to get up close as well, because there's all sorts of little things. You can see little crystals. And that's the really exciting bit for me. It's they're kind of almost living. They're kind of.
Do you expect that over a kind of 20-year time frame they will change slightly in terms of?
They're going to. What I've worked out, I have exposed them to extreme light, and they act very much like watercolours. So
they should be quite fast.
They're quite fast as long as you're not going to hang them on a sunny wall. I think they will settle. I think that they will. Some of the colours will mute. But the bright ones like the raspberry and the plum and things will sit forward. Yeah.
Excellent. And Charlie,
Can I talk a little bit about my work?
Yes. So sorry, I was going to say watercolour.
So it crosses over a bit. It's just interesting that you've used this paper. There was someone I was talking to on Instagram actually who was using it and sort of inspired me to use it. I think it's really beautiful. It's the first time I've used it. It's a little bit different to the really smooth flat paper, and I was thinking that your work's very sort of free, isn't it, and instinctual. Maybe, I'm not sure, yours sounded like it was kind of in between, like you kind of like you didn't really know what you knew what you were painting, but you weren't sure who the people in the pictures were.
I think, but also with regards to the materials, I think that because I chose a really coarse linen, the coarsest, it changes the way I paint. So you have to respond to the materials.
Because I was just thinking that mine, I think, is quite, particularly at the moment, is quite sort of careful and guarded, and I'm kind of very clear about what I want before. I think using this paper as using a new type of paper sort of changes the way that the work progresses. But generally, what I've been doing is I have quite a clear picture in my head. So my work was originally from a project called Los Allures, which is Guernsey French or Je ne sais for the myths, and it's called Myths in the exhibition. And my primary interest is in stories and storytelling, particularly mythological fairy tales. I've got lots of kind of early influences. I've always been interested in Bible stories. My grandfather used to tell me a lot of Bible stories when I was little, and I really loved those as well. And I think my work is just mainly about the idea that I enjoy envisioning stories, and I'm interested in what is like sometimes coined the mythic imagination. So it's this idea about how myths can inform us and help us understand our present situation. And I enjoy seeing or envisioning stories in my head, and particularly kind of thinking about how those images then might link into stories and myths that I enjoy or I feel that are important to me. I don't think I so much go about creating paintings to fit a story or a myth, but I have an idea of an image I want, and then I think, wow, that reminds me of Odin or Loki or Athena, and then I kind of push it in that direction.
So it's interesting because it links almost to kind of well, not fairy tales in a way, and how they kind of like may relate to everyday life.
Definitely,
Or how
fairy
you
tales are a really big interest of mine. I was interested in what you were saying about photography as well, about your how you created these images, sort of based but not copied photographs.
Inspired by, but not, yeah.
I do a lot of that as well, because photography is a big, I teach photography, I'm interested in the history of photography, and it's a big part of my work. So a lot of the compositions I come up with are discovered through photographing, but I don't necessarily, I use the photograph, but it's kind of more of a guide, and it's also, I also use a lot of sort of composite images, so I put lots of different photographs together.
Yeah.
So I just saw an amazing exhibition at the Tate actually called Capturing the Moment, and I think it's about the link between painting and photography.
Oh, interesting.
Very interesting and worth going to see.
No, I really like that, because I mean, I was always, traditionally I was always painting from life and very purist about it, but I think that with COVID I was forced to use photographs, and then it's kind of become something I've just learnt to embrace rather than resent in a way. And what I like about a photograph is you can take the composition photo, but you can then find little tiny composition within that, which is interesting. You know, you can zoom in and just find the element of it, and then, as you say, piece it together.
I think you can use it hand in hand with drawing from life as well.
Yes,
I definitely do that. So, you know, do a series of drawings, but use the photograph as a guide as well. So, yeah, I was interested in what you had to say about that, and also about not those people aren't necessarily, you don't know who they are.
Yeah, it's nice to leave it open.
Yeah.
You don't want it to be, I mean, it's, you know, I mean, for me, it's really important that people, like, the work is open enough that the viewer can see themselves in it, rather than just seeing me.
And was that part of your selection process for the photos?
I think it was honestly more, because I love people, I love having figures in my paintings. I wanted it to be figurative, and obviously a lot of your work is also figurative in that same way. But so it was more about finding compositions within photos which were interesting, rather than focusing directly on the figures. I think figures play a part in this body of work, but they're not. I mean, I think I have one or two paintings with no figures in at all. So that's like, I mean, it's a long time since I painted a painting without a figure in it. So.
I think that's interesting though, that idea that it's the figure in the environment. Like, I'm really interested in environmental photography. Arnold Newman is a photographer who photographed all sorts of people, like, you know, artists, scientists, politicians throughout the sort of like latter half of the 20th century, and they're always in their environment. And I find that really interesting. And it's not necessarily that, it's almost as if the environment's almost more interesting than the figure sometimes.
Yes.
That enhances the figure that's in
it's
the
all
image.
It's all one together almost, and it has to be kind of in harmony, for sure. And Bridget, with yours, I was so interested to hear that there's a dynamic nature to the dyes. So you're working kind of like over time, seeing how things change.
Yeah.
Was that a real challenge for you?
It was. What I learnt is that literally I had to do layers and then walk away and come back and see what I had done the next day. Once they're dry, they become permanent and they stay that colour. Obviously, if I added then another colour on top, that may again change, which is why I had to do all these different layers to see what each colour did. But very differently from you, I didn't really know what the outcome was going to be. It's kind of it's an organic process. It's kind of nature led. So, you know, I start making a few marks, walk around the page, go away, come back the next day, look at it and think, right, I think this needs some marks here. And again, there is composition and it's all thought about, but it's a very slow process. It's having to come back and almost sort of punctuate each picture.
Yeah.
After the sort of basic form is
Sounds
down.
a bit like cooking without a recipe. Is it a bit like that? It sounds very sort of like quite a feminine way of working. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I've cooked a lot.
Do you like cooking?
I've grown. So I have this very my life is basically this cycle. I grow things in the garden, cook them in the kitchen, then I potter out to my studio and do a bit of artwork, and it's this everything
circular
feeds
kind of
off everything.
Yeah, it's so lovely.
And my son came into the kitchen. He was quite hungry the other day, and he said, "Mum, are you making jam, ink, or dinner?"
I love that.
So, which one were you making?
I think that one was jam. Okay. But the dyes and the jam are very close, because basically you're making a preservative. But there's that great joy of nurturing and growing things and then using them, and I don't like wasting any of it. If I can possibly use it, and any of the leftovers then goes into my compost bin, which then I have this life that's in sort of cycles and circles. I sort of go from my raised beds to the kitchen to the studio, and the same again. The leftovers go in the compost bin, they go into the soil, which then grow things. And
it sounds really lovely, like you've sort of found your kind of, do you think it's something you've sort of been searching for in your work?
Nature has always been incredibly important to me. Growing up in Brazil, nature's big, and it kind of stings and bites. Then we used to come back to the UK in our holidays, and my grandmother used to live near a little wood, and they had an allotment. So it's very much part of my background. And she used to take me for little walks in the wood and everything, where you were allowed, apart from stinging nettles, you could pretty much touch everything. And she'd show me little anemones and things. So my grandmother's a huge influence, loved plants and flowers. And that kind of, it stuck and has been with me all the way through. So it just seemed really natural, having, as a child, helped on my grandparents' allotment, to then, when we at last had our forever home here, to have raised beds and grow my own.
I think it's interesting you're talking about grandparents, because I mentioned my grandfather. He's a massive influence on me because he used to tell me so many stories, and you're also talking about
it's also about my grandparents
as well. So that's
yeah.
And I wonder if it's because our parents, we have these lives nowadays that are so busy, and I think our parents started having those busy lives. I think, was it our grandparents that had the time to spend with us and talk to us? Or is that just normal? Is that...
It's always a special relationship, isn't it?
Yeah.
With your grandparents' generation. But I love what you're saying about your kind of circular life with your garden and your cooking and your inks, because your works are also circular.
Yes.
Yeah. I didn't notice
and
that.
Then,
absolutely.
But is there other reasons why?
There are. So it started with Jock throwing down the gauntlet at an exhibition I had at Candy in the Greenhouse Gallery. He came to one of my exhibitions, which was then the beginning of art of nature on paper, where I'd been printing off the beaches, and the idea, but completely behind the work, was to be a facilitator for nature. So basically I'm kind of giving nature a chance to create art. My main materials then were charcoal and cuttlefish ink, so everything was monochrome. So really had this urge to escape monochrome. I love colour, but at that time it was the right material for those projects. Anyway, Jock said, well, how about having a go at a project that starts in the soil? Which for me, great, because when we moved into our house is called Les Miel, which means sand dune. So our garden is sand. So literally anything I want to grow, I have to kind of start from scratch. I have to nourish the soil with compost and keep working at keeping it healthy. So having that conversation, I was thinking, I totally understand the importance of healthy soil. So I then grew, I had these 6 soil samples in my greenhouse. 3 were from the soil farm and 3 were from my own. I had this very thick gooey compost, I had leaf mulch, and then I just had my normal sandy soil. And I started experimenting with it. I buried paper in it to see what would happen, to see if things would grow. I was really hoping that was going to be the thrust of the where my work was going. but it just continually evolved. The paper did grow things. Then I experimenting with growing things into the Petri dish. Firstly, got the wrong recipe for the, I've forgotten what it's called, the medium that you grow Petri dishes. But I needed to make one which had protein in, and I was watching these dishes and nothing was happening. And then agar. Eventually, I did more research. So at every stage, it had to be researched and researched. Found that I had to get agar with protein in. So then grew my samples. And I was hoping that I was going to have these amazing, you know, like I'd seen on sort of when I'd been researching it, there were going to be these reds and yellows, but I just got loads of little white dots of varying sizes, with the sort of odd feathery frond in them. But so still kept working away at this project, and then discovered this book by Jason Logan, and I thought, oh, this is it, colour. I've just got to grow the plants in the soil. And then this is where the soil comes into this project. It's that they are the fruits of nutritious soil. And then it kind of goes full circle again, because some of the pictures are called nematode and things like that. So I'm going back referring.
So what's nematode?
So nematode, they're little tiny microscopic worms. They are many.
It's a nice word as well.
I forget it all the time. It doesn't stay in that one. They are microscopic worms, and there are good nematodes and there are bad nematodes, but we need them all. And you can use them also if you're an organic gardener. You'll use a certain breed of nematode to eliminate, say, slugs from your garden. They eat all the slug eggs and things like that. They also, as they travel through the soil, aerate the soil, and they eat each other and eat different things. But they are like the basic, or their soil is so complex, but they are very, very necessary, and a sign when you look through a microscope if you've got your wiggly nematodes in your soil.
The soil is good, or?
Yeah, you've got a good soil.
Interesting.
So that kind of, again, there's that circle again. There's lots and lots of circles. I've gone full circle from the soil to producing the ink to then create the picture of things that are in the soil.
Lovely.
So it has been a really mad project.
Do you think you'll do more of this? Do you think you'll carry on, or? I
think I will. I've bought some now specific seeds for dye plants, which is lovely because they all end in the tinctura. There's something tinctura. So got to plant those in the spring. I think it's very addictive. I think I'm going to be here with this idea for a while and see where, and just loving using colour. But early on, I thought I was just going to have a complete breakdown because I just didn't know how to use them. And I had to, like you, not only was I had to limit the project to homemade inks from my garden, and then I really wanted a cotton or a recycled paper. Inks, you can change the colour of each ink by adding bicarb or alum and things like that. So then I was just like, oh, where do I stop? You know, I started adding bicarb.
Sounds like you're very patient with your work. I don't know.
Well, then I had to kind of draw a line. And also, when I researched some of those things, actually they're not produced very nicely. There's a possibility that they are heavy polluters, the people who make those things. So it's kind of easier actually in the end, right, back again, restrict it down to just, they are, but most of them, I think all of them actually are salt, vinegar and the juice of the fruit or flower or root.
Did you find, I mean, when I chose my limited palette, I went for, you know, obviously variants for primary colours. And then I need to know that I've got that structure of the tonal depth and I've got my white. So, you know, when you say you restricted it, you got to playing with kind of nature, but also with thinking about the output and the composition and the kind of the tonal range and the colours as well. So is it
the outcome? Yeah. Well, if the outcome will be,
I think the thing that I found
beautiful.
hardest of all is all of the colours, I was early on. A lot of the colours were very boggy. They were kind of the browns,
Yeah, I
and
can imagine.
muted
Very
yellows and earthy.
I'm amazed how beautiful and bright this one is.
But
Especially,
then
the turquoise.
fruit, yes. And again, the green on there is the copper oxide. So that's
lovely.
literally just tiny little particles of copper just sitting on top of the paper. So a bit like your gold, really.
Yeah.
I've used that as my luxury
Yes,
item
yeah.
that I was going to take
Well,
to my desert island.
Interesting what you say about losing control, because I think with the gilding, I also, in some paintings, I was very restrained with my gilding, as in like it's very purposeful. But some of the paintings, I just kind of let it, just put the leaf down and just kind of let it do what it wanted to do. And also the paint wasn't completely dry when I put it on. So the oil size obviously takes the gold, but also the paint would hold the gold as well. So some of the paintings is a little bit more free in that sense. And it is really nice to have an element where you've lost control and you have to work with it, rather than it always being kind of a conscious artistic decision.
I was going to ask you about drawing, because a lot of my stuff, I do a lot of drawing before. Do you find that you go to your painting, because you're saying about being quite free, so do you draw before, or do you?
Well, I tend to, I like to sketch in oil. So like, for example, this one here, before I even started any paintings, I just thought, are these photographs going to work as paintings? And I just did a few on the back of old scraps of linen, grisaille sketches in oil to see whether I felt like they would work. And then immediately I was like, no, I think this is going to work. I think these are going to, because sometimes it can be translating a photo into a painting. Sometimes it just doesn't take, or the atmosphere isn't there. But I felt like almost there was more atmosphere in the painting than in the photograph.
Are there any artists that you look at, like, I don't know, like Gerhard Richter or Peter Doig, or they're artists that really, obsess over photographs?
So I did go to Peter Doig at Somerset House last year, and I did really like his kind of interpretation and freedom, and what I like about his paintings is they're quite iconic in terms of their compositions, especially that kind of the skier, which is, it's like, in a sense, it's not actually the quality of the painting, it's more the composition and the choice of colours and which becomes
he uses it very much as like a starting point, doesn't he? So although you can kind of in the background know that it's from a photograph, and I think a little bit about the same about that sketch up there. It doesn't like kind of he's not constrained by it, so he's very free, like like Bridget was saying about everything sort of materializing on its own and kind of making its own journey. He's very free with his work, but it comes from the photograph, and I wondered if your paintings were a bit like that.
Yeah, and also a lot of these photographs were half bleached out, and very they're aged,
You can exploit that.
Yeah, exactly. I quite like the fact that they're not too perfect, and that the edges were kind of blurred, and the sky's completely white, and that merges in with the mountains, and a lot of these scenes also, they just do look like they could be of Guernsey, even though they're of Hong Kong. They are, of the sea, of cliffs coming out of the sea, just one little house on the cliff. That Hong Kong's not built up at this point in time at all. It's and I can see maybe also how my great grandfather would have then come to Guernsey in the 1920s and been like, oh, this reminds me of Hong Kong.
It's interesting talking to you about islands, because my husband's family, obviously my family on my grandma's side, come from Guernsey, and a lot of my work is based around Guernsey. I mean, all the landscapes and places in my paintings are from Guernsey. There's nowhere else. It's all Guernsey. It all comes back to Guernsey for me. But it's interesting because when I think about it, and I thought about this a few years ago, but my husband's family are also islanders, and they come from the Hebrides.
Interesting.
And so my children, my 4 kids, have Guernsey on one side, and then they have Uist and Barra on the other side, and it's quite a strong heritage.
Absolutely, and this is
very
exactly because I just suddenly realised, well, my great grandfather moved to Hong Kong in 1870, and ever since we've been islanders. And what is it about islands that means that, and that's 6 generations now, where there was a short spell, in England in between, but there's something about island life which draws us back, kind of, and I feel like it's a gravitational thing, like the tide. We want to go and we go and explore the world, but then we come back again. And equally, my husband is an islander. He grew up on Hong Kong Island, so I'm also attracted to islanders. But it's completely subconscious. I'm completely, until you start thinking about these things and you realise how these themes run through your life, you don't.
I also think if you grow up in Guernsey or another island, like you were saying before, you don't really realise that it's happening to you in a sense, and then when you go to a different place, I think it's difficult for other people maybe to understand if they come from a big landmass, what it's like to live on an island, and some people find it very difficult.
Yeah, especially in terms of, even in Hong Kong and in Guernsey. I didn't want this project to be a compare and contrast of 2 islands, and I didn't want it to be like, here's a painting of Hong Kong and here's a painting of Guernsey.
Emotional reaction.
But I find that there are so many parallels, and when I lived in Hong Kong, I would walk down certain lanes or go hiking and I'd be like, gosh, this reminds me of Guernsey. And vice versa, sometimes if I walk down to Fermain Beach, that road is so similar to a lot of the roads in Hong Kong. But there is this, in Hong Kong you have the typhoons and you have black rain, and school and work is often called off because of the weather. And in Guernsey you have the fog, and you have, you're living in the world, in the real world, and you can't control it. And I quite like that. And when I'm in London, it's like everything is so easy and predictable. But I quite like the fact that although it's extremely annoying and you end up missing things, but actually, life is beyond your control sometimes.
I think what you're saying about universality is interesting as well, because, I think when I'm making paintings, I'm very much interested in working with the island and the island environment and what I can see out my window or down the road. But I think as artists, you're always trying to produce something which has universal appeal, which other people who don't come from that place can still understand. And the reason that I love stories, and I enjoy working with them, I don't think I could work with anything else really ever, I can't imagine, is I like that universality. I like the fact that when you read, an ancient story or, a fairy tale or a Bible story or a religious story, it has a universality which other people can kind of understand. And that's what I enjoy about stories.
Do you look into, because like some of the psychoanalysts and stuff, they're kind of very focused on using these stories as a kind of method of kind of like, analysis and interpreting people's lives, and which I find really interesting. Like Jung, for example, he loves these fairy tales and dreams, and as a way of kind of like getting into people's.
In a way, I guess. I guess. It's like in a slightly less scientific way. I'm interested in quite a few, I think they would coin themselves mythologists, people like Martin Shaw, he's an incredible writer, there's a lady called Sharon Blackie, and they are people who are sort of tasked or have tasked themselves with keeping old stories alive and showing people how stories can enhance their lives and how they can sort of bring, he talks about in some of his literature about stories providing people with oxygen so that they can kind of breathe and think again. And so I'm kind of interested in it more in that way, maybe more as kind
of opening.
Yeah, sort of opening up your understanding, linking you to other people. And, the work that I put into the exhibition is not just about, I'm really interested in Guernsey mythology and folklore, and British mythology and folklore. But there's all sorts of stuff, all sorts of influences, because when you read about stories, you understand that they're so linked, and they've travelled, and they've travelled across continents around the world, and you find stories in China
that parallels, like similar stories,
to European fairy tales, and the same with stories that are set in Guernsey or around the British Isles. So that again, it's that universality I like, and I'm particularly interested in those authors who explore that.
Yeah, interesting. And how does that influence your naming of your paintings? Because for me, that's always a bit of it's like half.
Yeah, it is.
Half of it is naming your paintings, and I decided to, although my work is very Hong Kong focused, I decided to bring in my Guernsey element through the titles of the paintings, and I'm really drawn to like everything I've been talking about is kind of like summarised in one of the verses of George Dainton's poem Sanya Cherie, which is like, I left thee in anger, I knew not thy worth, travelled afar to the end of the earth, to the earth. And I've always loved that verse. So, and it also kind of articulates, I think, that universal emotion of like, not necessarily just Guernsey, but just home, that like wanting to leave home, exploring, and then coming back, and not like really understanding how, like the value of what you've been brought up with until you've left it.
I think it's quite interesting because I get emotional, like you said, hearing Sanya Cherie, but I'm not from here. Yeah. I'm not from Ireland.
Yeah. I was going to ask you that actually.
Grew up on a huge landmass. You know, I grew up in South America, in Brazil, and almost through sailing and doing lots of yachting in my youth, almost sought out islands.
Interesting.
And now I do feel really this is, you know, I found my island. Yeah. It took a bit of hunting, you know, and it wasn't easy to move here. Lots of things happened to try and stop it happening. And then when we did eventually come, it was very difficult. But now, you know, we've been living in our sort of granite farmhouse for 7 years, and at last I feel a bit like the project, you know, I've got my roots going down into the soil here. And the thing I like about island life, I think I couldn't imagine living on a smaller island. I couldn't live in Sark or Alderney. Yeah. Because here we have the community, and I loving people and community. I think it's wonderful. But we do have that frame where we're in that, maybe is that kind of, you know, I'm at sea, I'm on the sea, but I'm safe in my warm house, warm and dry house, you know. So it's quite a sanctuary actually. It's sort of almost, you're almost protected by the water.
Doesn't always feel it in the winter, but I agree, yeah.
But, you know, we don't have a motorway, you know, within earshot or anything like that. You know, in that way, it protects us. It keeps it very special, I think.
I definitely think there is something to be said about how you do feel very sort of like, maybe a bit mollycoddled in Guernsey, you know, like there's a safety that you feel here, and then when you go somewhere else, that kind of is taken away, and that's exciting. But there is that sense of coming home. I think it's very strong. I mean, I'm sure everyone feels it about their home, but I think because you've got that kind of little triangle shape and you kind of imagine coming back to it, that maybe it feels extra strong sometimes. Yeah.
But do you think kind of once an islander, always an islander? Is it kind of, can you ever take the island? I don't know. I think once you've lived that life, you carry it with you.
I can't imagine living anywhere else.
Because I found that when I left, I mean, I had 13 years living away from the island. But whenever I told anyone I came from an island, all they wanted to talk about was island life. You know, it's so interesting to other people. Yeah. It's like, oh, you come from Guernsey, what's that? You know, and then it, without even knowing it, becomes so much part of your identity. Oh, that's Sally from Guernsey. And you can't shake it off. It's like, it's always there, that kind of, and I don't think you get the same if you come necessarily from a little village in, you know, Dorset or Yorkshire or something. It's, there is a fascination, I think, with island life.
I think the sea,
agree, yeah.
I mean, we just can't, for me, you know, this is that, the love of the sea, you know, we can't get away from it, can we? We're sort of, with our tides and the way we grow and shrink, you know.
I think culturally you feel, I mean, I feel very sort of bound to Guernsey, very culturally and emotionally and culturally, and I feel very much part of it, and that makes, that's part of being in the community, but it's also part of being in the landscape, part of being, you know, inside, like I say, in that little triangle with the sea around the edge. And I don't know how you feel about that, but I do feel very Guernsey. I feel very proud to be from Guernsey. Just not to say that I don't want to go away to other places sometimes, but I feel linked. And I couldn't imagine my work not being about home.
And that was a question I wanted to ask you actually, because family, you have family. That's what I miss terribly here, is that I don't have family. But your work, your family, your children, and I noticed one the other day with your grandmother in, you know, I envy you firstly because I can't paint. I just look at a picture I've tried to create of my children or my husband and I just hate it. I just feel I can never properly do them justice. So I think you're very brave painting your family. But what role do they have in your work?
I think they're probably everything. I mean, they're you know, I've got 4 children and my life is very busy and full of them. And I just suppose I think they're the most interesting, fascinating beings that I've ever met, and infuriating sometimes. But I couldn't imagine not putting them in the work. I mean, I think particularly young people, you know, I mean, I use my whole family. I've used my dad in a recent painting, like say my grandma. But a lot of the work is about the kids because I think they're at a very interesting age as well. They're sort of, my youngest is 8, my oldest is 15, and they're kind of in that transitional age, and I enjoy showing that in the work. And because the work is so much about this kind of idea that stories and myths are everywhere, and you know, you look at, you know, your father and you see Odin, you look at your son and you see Loki, and I kind of feel, I suppose, the stories are so intertwined in the work that I can't help but use them because they're there in front of me.
There is nothing more interesting than just painting the life around you.
Yeah.
Because it will be even more interesting in like 20, 30 years time when you look back, and it'll be so meaningful.
Absolutely,
Yeah, because you can't get that moment back again.
Absolutely.
Yeah.